If Airbnb was banned in Medellin, would it fix rent prices? So let's just have a look at this hypothetical scenario because it's quite interesting. So let's say tomorrow Airbnb becomes banned, it's illegal. All those listings in El Poblado, Laureles, Envigado, Sabaneta, etc. would be completely obsolete. Medellin has around 12 to 15,000 Airbnb listings, and of those, 3,500 are in El Poblado alone. So the kind of density of these Airbnb units is quite concentrated, and the property owners of those Airbnbs would panic. Some of them will have bought them purely for investment. Some of them will be used to having the income from Airbnb rentals because it's so much more than kind of long-term rentals in the city. I think there would be a mix of some owners just trying to sell those units really quickly before prices go down too much. Others would immediately take those listings onto the long-term rental market, which in the short term, yes, would bring down prices. Supply and demand. If the market is basically flooded with new stock, supply, the price goes down, assuming demand stays around the same. But that being said, some of the customers, the tenants using Airbnb on short-term rentals will be able to flip to long-term rentals like 30-day stays, 3-month stays, that kind of thing. I know that from experience because when I landed in Colombia, I was just doing month-to-month on Airbnb. But if I was to get a good deal for, let's say, a 3-month stay or a 2-month stay, that kind of thing, I would have taken that. But yes, the vast majority of Airbnb owners in Medellin are local Colombians, just like how it is in any other city. And so a lot of them would try and sell their properties, I believe, to take their money out, especially if they bought those units specifically for Airbnb. And maybe the more kind of accidental Airbnb owners, like I was in London, because I used to rent my flat out in Notting Hill on Airbnb while I could as a kind of secondary source of income. Those kind of people, those accidental Airbnb landlords would just put their apartment on the long-term market in Medellin. But here's the thing, because the stock of those Airbnbs are concentrated in those specific areas, think El Poblado, Barrio Manila, Laureles, places in Envigado, etc., those areas would see reductions in rent. So basically kind of middle-class Colombians who are renting in those areas or who would want to rent in those areas would see a positive side to this because they would have more bargaining power because of more properties, same amount of demand, etc. But for locals who are not living in those Airbnb areas, so think Bello, La Estrella, maybe in El Centro, Robledo, places like this, Colombians living in these areas who want to rent properties would not see much of a change because these areas do not have that many short-term rentals via Airbnb. So it's interesting, it's almost like the city has lots of different kind of microcosms of rental units, etc. Some would see big drops, others wouldn't. And I guess this is like the same in any other city. I know in Barcelona they have already kind of implemented like an Airbnb ban, kind of like we're talking about hypothetically here. And yes, some areas will have loads of Airbnbs, others not so much. And I'm not sure of the specific numbers. I've tried to do a little bit of digging, but it's hard to find out. But the kind of the high-end, super-duper luxury Airbnbs, which have, 4 bedrooms, 4 en-suites, jacuzzi, roof terrace, that kind of thing, these properties hitting the open market for rental or being sold won't really trickle down too much for kind of rental prices for normal, let's say, normally finished, let's say 1 or 2 bedroom apartments. So that's also something to consider as well. I'm not sure what the percentage is of, let's say, those 3,500 Airbnb units in Poblado. How many of those are super duper luxury units? Maybe 50%? I'm not too sure. And these apartments are designed around short-term stays. They have kind of jacuzzis. They're not really made for family living, that kind of thing. So if there was a family who wanted to rent a kind of family-style apartment in El Poblado, for example, wouldn't really go for these super duper high-end luxury apartments which are made for short-term stays. If that makes sense, I'm not really sure if I explained that well. I'm not an economist, by the way. I'm just playing out this hypothetical scenario because I find it quite interesting. So yeah, the little micro economy around Airbnb, if it was banned and let's say made illegal tomorrow, would lose out as well. So think cleaning companies which clean all these daily rentals, property management companies. I've spoken to lots of people in Medellin who work for property management companies, so this is a big industry. So all of these kind of industries will go basically overnight because there's no demand for it right now, and would give renters an upper hand in the rental market because there's going to be a surplus of properties, well, way more properties than there were before, and more or less the same amount of demand-ish. So yeah, people who want to rent properties would have the upper hand here. But then on the flip side, Airbnb is a great tax revenue generator for Medellin and Colombia in general, and so all the tax revenue from those short-term stays via Airbnb would just get lost overnight, and more of those short-term rentals would get pushed to kind of the underground economy. So think Facebook Marketplace, WhatsApp, kind of just handshake deals, that kind of thing. So people who really do just want to stay in an apartment for a week, for example, would find a way to make it happen, and it wouldn't be regulated. It would be cash in hand, there'd be no tax, that kind of thing. So that wouldn't be the norm, I don't think. That wouldn't be the majority of properties that go like that, but definitely that kind of underground economy would start booming if Airbnb was made illegal, for example. Interestingly, along with rents coming down in those kind of Airbnb areas, also property prices in those areas would fall as well. well, because some people who own Airbnb properties, either investors or kind of accidental landlords, I guess, would just want to sell their property to get their cash out and to put it into something else. Because remember, the Airbnb model and the Airbnb industry in Medellin is so popular because property owners can rent their properties out for so much more money, let's say to digital nomads via Airbnb, compared to what they would get in pesitos from a local, for example. So those landlords who are kind of financially motivated would literally just try to pull their money out of the market. Let's say they have 5 Airbnb rentals in Provenza, which this happens, by the way. This is what people do. Mainly Colombians as well, my ad. So this is mainly Colombians doing the investing. It's only a small section of foreign investors doing that. They will just try and sell their properties really quickly. And so this would cause a little dip potentially in property prices in those areas. And so for people who already own properties, this might not necessarily be good news because the value of their assets is going down. But on the other hand, for people who are not yet on the property ladder but who want to buy properties in those areas, could potentially be great. For example, if you want to buy a super swanky apartment in El Poblado right now, it's going to be pretty expensive, maybe let's say 2 billion pesos, for example. But hypothetically, tomorrow Airbnb gets banned, the owner of that super swanky flat you really want to buy might sell it to you for, 1.5, maybe even less. So there would be really good deals to have in those specific kind of Airbnb hot areas like Laureles, parts of Envigado, El Poblado, potentially Sabaneta, that kind of thing. But yeah, it's the same in any city. The winners of falling property prices are people who do not have properties but who want to get on the property ladder. But people who already own properties, it might not be that good news because the value of their assets is going to go down. On the other hand, for example, if those property owners have kids, they might not mind the value of their property is going down because it means their kids have more of a chance of getting on the property ladder. So I guess it is a little bit like that, but that's the same in every city. But with that potential fall in prices, I think construction could slow down even more in Medellin because there's just going to be less demand for properties. There's going to be less Colombian investors trying to cash in on the Medellin kind of Airbnb bubble. And because construction is kind of centered around those areas anyway, think new projects in Poblado, Laureles, Envigado, Sabaneta, that kind of thing, that could potentially slow down because developers like doing projects in areas where they know they're going to be able to sell the units. They're not going to sell a ton of units if they did a project in El Centro, in Medellin, for example. So construction could potentially slow down. And while that wouldn't really do anything in the short term, potentially medium to long term, that could be a problem. If the construction slows down because of a lack of Airbnb, then construction again isn't going to be able to keep up with the demand. But then again, there's just going to be less demand for that kind of accommodation in Medellin because let's say digital nomads may just look to other countries or other cities like Bali, Bangkok, places like this. Because I don't know, I'm a little bit different. I moved here with the intention to stay, but loads of people just want to come here for a few months and then go somewhere else, and they're kind of in their traveling era. So those kind of people would just skip Medellin. They'll just go to another city in Colombia, or they go to another country altogether. But so yeah, potentially that little digital nomad industry in Medellin would collapse. But you know what? If that means that you can actually get a seat in your local Pergamino, then I'm all for that, because I like when I buy a drink in coffee, I like being able to actually drink it in the shop rather than having them pour it into a cup so it gets cold instantly and have to drink it on the street because some fucker's using his laptop to watch TV. Anyway, I digress. But definitely with that, Medellin's local economy would take a massive hit. Think about how many jobs are kind of centered around hospitality, tourism, Airbnb, short-term rentals, think tours, nightlife, Ubers, taxis, like restaurants, Spanish schools, all of this stuff in Medellin that really kind of powers the economy would basically not collapse overnight, but it would start slowing down significantly. And potentially this might not be good news for locals because while their rent will be coming down, they also might lose their job. And so it's a little bit of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, and it's difficult to see the actual consequences of that. But overall, I think locals would benefit from like a total ban on Airbnb. By the way, I'm trying to be as impartial as I can on this. I'm not saying for or against. I'm just playing out the hypothetical scenario where this happened. What I will say though is in London, there is a 90-night limit per calendar year for Airbnb, meaning that you can just rent your property out on Airbnb 90 nights per calendar year. After that, it doesn't allow you to book anymore via the app. You can start using other apps, but then you don't get the same level of insurance. You're not kind of as covered as you are on Airbnb, for example. And so this is what I did in London. I just used up my 90 nights a year, and then I kind of stopped using Airbnb, for example, and kind of waited for January the 1st to do that again. Maybe that is like a happy medium that the government could do here in Medellin, because I do agree that having, 15,000 Airbnbs in Medellin is probably overkill, because if you actually go on Airbnb in Medellin and like look for an apartment to rent, there is so much supply and so much choice. It's just frankly ridiculous. It's like you can just see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of like 1-bedroom apartments, studios, 2-bedroom apartments. A lot of them are just sitting there unused, and those could be put on the open market for like local Colombians to use, that kind of thing. So I do agree that there needs to be some sort of discussion around this, and maybe having that 90-day limit would be a really good idea in that regard. It would tackle the problem of these empty properties artificially keeping rents high, but at the same time it wouldn't completely decimate the tourist industry that Medellin basically relies on so much. Like, I'll just give you an example. I went for a run this morning at around, was it 5:45, 5:30, past the metro stations and everything. And when you run past the metro station or you walk past the metro station, you can just see basically all of the people who service this hospitality industry, like cleaners, taxi drivers, security guards, all of this stuff. And so this forms a big part of the economy in Medellin, and they don't want to just lose that overnight. But then again, that would tackle rents in Medellin, but is it going to make Menu del Dia cheaper? Is it going to make the metro fare cheaper? Is it going to make kind of food cheaper in Colombia? Definitely not. And so even though it tackles one problem, which is rents, other problems still persist. And Colombia and Medellin in particular still have problems with inflation. And I found this quote which illustrates it well. It said, international demand entered a city, Medellin, where local salaries are relatively low, prices separate from local incomes. And so this happened in Mexico City, Barcelona, Bali, Lisbon, etc. And basically the same has happened in Medellin when you have external money, international money basically, entering a market where salaries are relatively low. So yeah, it would not fix the overall inflation problem. Like, for example, them increasing salaries by almost 25%, but it would help to bring down rents in those specific areas. But if you are a property owner in those areas, and let's say you do use Airbnb and everything, of which are the vast majority are Colombians, then it probably would not be great news for you. But yeah, let me know what you guys think. It'd be interesting to have a discussion in the comment section with you all. All viewpoints welcome. There's no restriction on freedom of speech here. Take care, guys. Cow.